It's a real honor and pleasure to introduce you the two founding fathers of self-determination theory, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. Rich and Ed have laid a theoretical foundation, and as a group of SDT scholars, we are facing the challenge to further expand the framework and to refine it in many different directions. So Rich and Ed, by this point, I'm getting all thrilled to hear you give your opening address here on this 5th International Conference on SDT. And so I would like to very much welcome you here. The floor is all yours.
I'm really pleased to be here. I'm pleased to see all of you here. I'm pleased to see that people from 38 countries have come here to participate in a dialogue about these ideas. So we're here to talk about self-determination today, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to go with that, but we're welcoming you here to Rochester because this is a place where dialogue about self-determination theory really began. So I want to say one thing why I think self-determination theory has grown particularly big recently. And that's because we take a point of view on behavior that was unusual in our field, and there's really been a real turn in the way that people think about human motivation. And when I say that, we call it a Copernican turn in the same way that at one time people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun revolved around it. At one time in our field, this was the model of motivation that most of us learned and were socialized in. In this model of motivation, and it's not a wrong model of motivation, it's actually a very powerful and potent model of motivation. If you have an organism and you've got complete control over the organism's environment, you can, with rewards and punishment, get that organism to do almost anything. Not anything, but almost anything. And 50 years of behavioral research, I think, attest to the power of rewards and punishments in such an environment. So it's not that that theory is wrong. The problem is it's the metaphor. It's not the metaphor, it's the reality of the cage, which is most of us are not in a cage in the same way. We might be controlled by rewards and punishments or the contingencies that somebody puts us under, but if we really don't like it or it becomes particularly aversive, at least for many of us, we can leave the cage. So we don't have to be subjected to that, and what the issue in modern motivation has to recognize that people do have choices. They go in directions that they want to go, and we need to understand the basis within people that's moving them to make this choice or that choice. So the study of motivation today is really the study of why people choose what they do, and then once they make that choice, what's going to sustain them on that path, whether that path be something that we'd want them to do or not want them to do. So our three basic needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. We've heard some things about them today, but I'm just going to briefly say what they are. For us, relatedness is feeling cared for and connected to others. It has to do with a sense of belonging, a feeling that you matter to the other people that are there, and relatedness is enhanced not just by people treating you warmly and including you, but it's also enhanced by your giving to them and your being able to matter in their lives. That's part of what helps us feel connected. So it's not a one-way street in relatedness, it has to do with both, and again, we'll show evidence to that effect. Competence is really commonly studied in psychology. Most theories of psychology would probably agree with us on this one point, which is competence is essential to wellness. To feel effective in your environment, to have some sense of mastery of the things that are important to you, very, very important, and environments can have a big impact on that experience. And then finally, finally autonomy, which has been probably the most controversial, but also the most central of our psychological needs in the sense of research and our integrative mission, so to speak. Autonomy refers to behavior that is self-endorsed, that you agree with and find congruent within yourself. And so autonomy here means that you feel choiceful, self-initiating, and when you're fully autonomous, you're wholeheartedly behind the thing that you're doing. And again, because of that wholeheartedness, that's why performance tends to be better when you're acting out of autonomous motives. It's been very important to us to clarify autonomy as not some other things, and the main one I want to point out is that it is not about independence. So the term autonomy sometimes can be used as independence. If you look it up in the dictionary, some definitions will have it as independence. But in self-determination theory, we define independence as not relying on other people for goods or for needs or for support. So if you're independent, you're not turning to other people. But you could be volitionally independent. You could be autonomously independent. That means you could say, I want to do something on my own. I don't want to rely on others in this task. But you could also be autonomously dependent. When you go to others for help When I turn to Loretta for help in our department, usually I'm doing that volitionally and out of autonomy. I want the help of another person. When I go to see my physician to heal me, I say, I'm sick, could you heal me? Because she has the expertise to do so. So I'm autonomously dependent in those situations. And we can also say that in the same sense, autonomy is not about individualism either. Because I can be autonomously individualistic if I value individualistic kinds of arrangements between people, but I could equally and probably even more likely be autonomously collectivistic. Because there are good reasons to be collectivistic that I can internalize and have that be the core of my value system. So while some people have tried to say collectivism is not congruent or compatible with autonomy, we say just the opposite. The best collectivisms are those where people are volitionally participating in collective good. And we can see that in societies that are heteronomously collective. We see a lot of instability and poor well-being, but societies that are autonomously collective have a very different picture. Finally, autonomy is not about not having demands or rules or inputs from the outside. The issue of autonomy is really whether we concur with and find them legitimate and meaningful. So if I go to the airport here, and I'm in the front of the airport, and the TSA person wants to search my bags and says, open your bags, it's a command, it's a demand. Can I be autonomous in following that? Well, yes, I can if I believe in the value of the security that's there. If it becomes arbitrary or seemingly unnecessary, maybe now I don't feel it's so legitimate, and I might not feel autonomous in that situation. My point only being that autonomy is not about whether the input comes from the outside, but it's rather whether you concur with that input as it comes to you. So we're going to see that distinction a lot. And this brings me back to the core broad strokes of this theory, which is we argue that there are these three basic psychological needs, and when they are satisfied, this leads us to the highest quality motivation we can have, which is fully volitional. It also enhances our wellness and our social relationships, as we've seen in some of the talks today. We are mainly a psychological theory. Our core theory is about human experience and the issue of human experience having an impact on all the things that we do, on our behavior, on our health, on our wellness, and our social relations. Our focus is on human experience as the fundamental core of what we study because we're fundamentally psychologists. So with that, I want to say, I'm going to turn it over to Ed so he can begin on intrinsic motivation processes.
The first thing I want to say is that it is overwhelmingly wonderful to see all of you people here. When you think about the important turn that Rich was speaking of moving from motivation as a wholly outside the person concept to something that begins inside the person, the only place you can start if you're thinking in that way is intrinsic motivation. It is the prototype of autonomous motivation. So, of course, the research started with intrinsic motivation, which went against the grain of what was happening in psychology at the time. But so what, Going against the grain is a pretty good thing sometimes. So intrinsic motivation. It really means doing an activity because you find the activity interesting and enjoyable. It satisfies the basic psychological needs, which Rich just laid out for you. It's the prototype, really, of willingness and choice. Intrinsic motivation promotes learning and revitalization, not only for children, but across the lifespan. However, it's the play of children that is the perfect example of intrinsic motivation. Who has ever had to motivate a child to play? It's all right there in our nature to be active, and play is an expression of our inherent active nature. In contrast to intrinsic motivation is extrinsic motivation. And what that means quite precisely is doing an activity because the activity leads to some separable consequence. Rewards, avoidance of punishment, trying to gain social approval, whatever it is. Now, those are both kinds of motivation. Intrinsic motivation is, extrinsic motivation is. They energize behavior, and together they stand in contrast to amotivation, or being unmotivated. Amotivation means that you have no intentionality to behave, and when that's the case, you don't behave very much. Now, early on, we were interested in a question. You've got intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And early on, we got interested in the question of whether these two types of motivation are additive or perhaps interactive. Many people not many people, but a few people in psychology and a few people in economics would just say, any kind of incentive or any kind of motivation, even if there are kinds, who cares if there are, because they just all add up together to give you the total amount of motivation or the total amount of incentives that are operating in that kind of situation. But we weren't sure that that was necessarily the case, and so really the empirical work started with this very question. So that was the reward studies. Some have been talked about already, both in terms of neuroscience and in terms of psychology, at least mentioned in the earlier talks. But the first reward studies with humans showed that giving college students money for working on interesting activities actually led the students to be less interested in the activities than they were before, or than other people were who were doing the same activities without rewards. It was controversial at the time. That was kind of the heyday of behavior modification, where everybody looked to rewards as a way of motivating. But that's not so bad that it's controversial, because that gets a lot of research going. And by the very late 1900s, Richard Kessner, I don't know where he is, but I saw him earlier, and Rich Ryan and I looked at all the studies. We found 128 published studies looking at the effects of rewards on intrinsic motivation, and sure enough, the undermining effect held strong for tangible rewards. There are limitations here and there and nuances, of course, but the primary message is yes, indeed, it's the case that rewards, tangible rewards, can undermine intrinsic motivation. Applying that in the realm of healthcare, for example, a study by Arlen Moeller, who's also here someplace, I saw him earlier, he looked at the issue of rewarding people for sustained healthy behavior change. And he did an interesting thing in this, which is he looked at people's motivation for financial rewards, for wanting to attain that's the degree to which that's an important motivation for people. And he's got some people who are very high in that type of motivation and some that are very low. And what he finds is that initially everybody shows a little bit of, in this particular instance, of weight loss. A lot more was the case for people who were low in the financial motivation than those who were high. But the even more interesting thing is those people who were high in financial motivation for doing this actually gained back all the weight and some more besides. That's the top piece of the graph that you see over there. Whereas people who were low in the strong desire for financial rewards actually lost a lot more motivation, and it maintained, in fact, increased over time.